I'm Martha Wolf. My husband, Madison, and I, and a 6-month-old baby, Jim, came to Huntsville in the summer of 1947. Madison came here to teach photo engraving. And Dr. Lohman was president of the college then, and he was really trying to take care of World War II veterans who had returned, and there was a big demand at that time for photo engravers. And we had the photo engraving plant at Country Campus. There were no houses to buy nor to rent. So part of our package was that they would furnish us a barracks. We were pioneers. The first bath I gave Jimmy, my 6-month-old, was in the latrine after much scrubbing and sanitizing. We did end up staying there 9 years with a very lovely place to live. I was teaching at Riverside during part of that time. When our younger daughter became 7 years old, no kindergarten back then, I started teaching at Riverside and took my children there with me. We were in a 4-teacher school, 8 grades. I taught 5th and 6th grades. We had a total ADA of 54 students, and they were always there. Our funding depended on our ADA, average daily attendance. And they would come to school to hold that ADA up. One time we had a bad water supply, and all of us had to get typhoid shots. Well, that was bad news. It was hot, and my husband got me a great big old 10-gallon igloo. And we carried water from here, from Huntsville, in gallon jugs. And I froze ice. I had a great big old freezer, one of those big old chest type freezers. And I would take a gallon bucket that they gave me the bucket in the cafeteria. And I kept several buckets of ice going. Everybody brought their cup. And we had water in our room. We were all sick. I'll finish that story. We all ran temperature. We all went to school every day to keep that ADA up. And we'd wash our faces and try to keep the temperature down, and the county nurse, Ruby Crumno, would come by and check on us. And everybody had their little cup of ice water. We sat like that a couple or 3 days until I'd say, just put your heads on the desk, and I'd put my head on my desk. Oh, we were a sick bunch of people out there.
That's fun.
Well, we had to keep that. We had to have that money to operate on, and everybody was sick. But oh, the parents at Riverside. I know one time Margene got sick. I said, oh, I've got to get a substitute in. I've got to take this baby home. So we didn't have a phone in the school. And I sent one of the students down to the post office, which was just a stone's throw from us, to phone Sybil Holly. I said, to tell her to come to that school. I needed to see her. And I had one of her kids in my room then anyway. Had Dale in there, and she came running and, oh, Martha, what's the matter, what's the matter? I said, Sybil, Margene is throwing up. I've got to get her home and get her settled down. but I've got to have a substitute, and I want you to phone Moselle McLeod and tell Moselle to get out here real fast. Sybil said, it's not necessary. You stay here and teach my child, and I'll take care of yours. I mean, it was that kind of situation. At Riverside, we were really uptown. We had a big concrete floor toilet, had a commode, and I believe we had that rather nice sized building, which was outside of the school, joined by, I don't think it was joined by anything. I don't think we had a breezeway or roof. We might have. I'm unsure about that. But that we had one commode for the boys and one commode for the girls. Had a wall, of course, between. Well, those commodes were always in trouble. So Helen Walterman and I were the two brave souls. And she knew, she was pretty good at plumbing. But I learned, and we would go out there with our wrenches and our plumber's friend, and you ought to have seen us out doing our plumbing. One time in my 5th and 6th grade classroom, I had 13 total enrollment, and I mentioned one day, I said, wouldn't it be nice if we had a linoleum on this floor? It would just be so good, and if we had our bookshelves painted, because I immediately started collecting books for a library, and nothing else was said. You know, I was just kind of dreaming out loud. Do you know, we came back to school that following Monday, there was a linoleum and bookshelves. Those parents, some of the kids went home. I always had children whose fathers, the McGill-Berrys, and he was on the school board, and came back, and that room was exactly like we wanted it. The first year I taught there, one of my little 6th graders was Elmer Corcoran. He really was just the dearest little boy. So he brought me for a gift, had a little shoebox. Oh, Miss Wolf, I brought you a present. It was a little snake. Well, we kept that snake, and it was a baby snake. And I told him, I said, Elmer, I don't know how to take care of this snake. I believe you better take this snake back to his mama. And when he gets bigger, well, then you can bring him back. Well, he very happily took that snake off. Then, not too long, he brought me a baby mockingbird. Well, if you've ever tried to teach school with a squawking baby mockingbird, but he had the little bird in a little cage. So we took the little bird, nobody in the school could teach. Then we took the little bird and hung the cage from a tree limb. And of course we hung out the window half the day watching the little bird to see that everything was all right. Oh, and the river came up, that was before the dam, and we just stopped school, loaded the bus up, and went down to the bridge to show the kids that the river had come up. Yeah. They got a good education. And I did too.
My name is J.N. Scarborough, and wife Clara Scarborough. I came to Huntsville in 1924. I had gone to Huntsville school, finished the 10th grade, run out of money. My parents moved down here to send us to school to try to educate, but they couldn't make a living here, so they moved back to Houston County on our farm. I chose to stay here. I applied to all the dry goods stores in Huntsville for a job, and I couldn't get one. So I went to Southwestern Bell Telephone Company. It was in the spring of 24. And I asked them for a job. They gave me a job. And we were putting down a telephone line from Huntsville to Madisonville. I worked that summer. Oh, it was hot. It was dry. We had to dig those holes with hand post hole diggers. So in the fall, I had decided maybe I'd go back to school, but then Jesse E. Bryan, who owned Jesse E. Bryan Dry Goods Store, I had applied there before, got a hold of me and gave me a job, and I was delighted to get out of that hard work into so I could kind of dress up, you know. I worked for Jesse E. Bryan. He had a dry goods store. He handled ladies and men's ready to wear. And I worked there for Mr. Bryan for a year. And business was slow when it was bad, so he went out of business. I was out of a job. Next to the theater there was Nance Dry Goods Company. That's where I went to work next. I worked there, I believe, until 27. The store burned. I was out of a job. So I went to the Grand Leader, asked for a job. I went to Louis E. Ball, who was in the dry goods business, applied. So they both offered me a job, but Grand Leader offered me a little more money. I think Louis E. Ball offered me $12.50 a week. Grand Leader offered me $15, so that's what I took. Claire, I met Claire in 1927. She was secretary for Nance Drug Store, which is over on the east side, on the corner where the travel agency is now. Back in those days, you collected bills. You didn't mail bills out. You'd get a satchel with your bills all in it, and here you'd go, collect it. She came in the store, that was really before I met her, and collected a bill from me, and she wrote out, said, "I'd sure hate to have that long name." Well, I just worked as a general clerk in Bryan, Jesse Bryan, and Nance, but in Grand Leader, I was in charge of the shoe department. Those country girls would come in here and go to college, and they'd wear that Hart's cologne, you know. I knew the smell. They'd shop outside there. I had a nice display in Grand Leader there, and of shoes, and we had those novelty shoes, real short, high heel, little round toe, and those girls would come in. Of course, I'd put a foot, you know, on it to see what size, but I learned don't tell them what size. And I'd bring a shoe out, and the first thing we put it on, "What size is this?" And they'd look at it. I said, "Well, I'm supposed to fit you." I said, "You forget about your size. We got to fit you where your feet will be comfortable." Maybe I'd have a 7 and a 50. I wear a 5. That's right. Well, I finally got them trained to let me fit them right, yeah. But I had one girl that came in, and of course she had an eye on me, see. She'd come pretty often, and she'd try shoes, and she'd bend on them, and man, they just ruin them. And finally I told her one day, I said, "Listen, are you coming in here to buy a pair of shoes, or are you flirting with me?" She said, "I'll tell you the truth, I'm flirting with you." I said, "Well, I want you to quit ruining those shoes." Back in those days, we had what they call a Keep Hotel up from on 12th Street on the corner in front of Dr. Cole's office, and where we'd go and dance. We had big dances up there, and boy, we could put it on the top shelf. But anyhow, I'll tell you a good one up there at the Grand Leader. The prison system was on up above the Grand Leader and Felder Dry Goods, and they would release those inmates, and they gave them, I think then, maybe $50. And so there's a Mr. Wilson worked for Felder's up there, and he would get out and try to stop them. Well, Mr. Louis Cohen, who I worked for at the Grand Leader, would get out. We had a side door on that street to get out there. So I heard them out there one day, just, man, they were going to Fifth City. And it's over, Mr. Cohen was accusing Mr. Wilson of getting his customers. Well, really, there wasn't no more Cohen's customers than, but that's how bad business was. Let me tell you something. When I first started to work on the corner up there, I'm not calling any names, but the man, when I went in, he said, now come on in here, Jim. I want to tell you, now I'm giving you a job. I'm going to pay you $15 a week. I said, okay. And he said, what do you think I'm hiring you for? I said, you hiring me to sell, and that's what I'm going to do. He said, well, now I want to tell you something. He said, on Saturday, country people come to town, and they roam the square. And that's what they did. They come in and walk. He said, when you're not busy in this store, get out there on that street and get people in the store. Well, I didn't like that much. I didn't think that was a thing to do. But anyhow, I did it because I had to hold my job. And I never could get anybody in. And every Saturday it'd be about the same people. So one day this old man come by, had a cigar. And they tell it on him, said he had smoked part of it one Saturday, and before he'd get home, he'd put it out and save it. When he got to town the next Saturday, he'd light it up. So I had hit him up the Saturday before, so I got out there, I saw him coming. And so he said, well, I guess you're going to drag me in your store today, huh? I said, no, I just want to talk to you. I said, do you think it's right if I get out here and try? No, I don't. If I want something, I'll come in the store to get it. So I told this man that. He didn't like it much, but anyhow, I didn't go back out there. I didn't work too much longer for him. Mr. Jesse Bryan had an automobile dealership, and he handled Star cars. So I bought a Star car from him, and it is a convertible. And it had a motor meter out there like a cow's head with horns sticking out. And on each end of those horns, there was big lights. And it was a sight, that car was. Man, I'd make a trip up at the college, and you talk about the gals, I had them pile in there, just get in that thing, and we'd have a time riding around the square. On each corner of the square, there's a big steel post that flared with 4 lights on each side, on all 4 corners. And we would go around that thing, we'd go around it. I mean, just around those things, when the law wasn't watching us.
I'm Cecil Williams. I was born in Huntsville, Texas, July the 4th, 1927. In fact, as we consider this as Huntsville, Texas, I was born about maybe 300 yards from here. This was a Cotton Creek community. John Tip Hightower squatted all this land here. For the first people that lived here free was John Tip Hightower and his family. And the Johnsons right up here. Okay, they came in here right after slavery. See, the Hightowers was so prevalent in this community because the Hightower plantation was right across the road over there. Tip was freed at 18. He was born in 1841. And he got a title to this land in 1873. And it was deeded to him from the governor of Texas, who at that time was L.R. or J.R. Ross. I got a title here somewhere to that. When he got the title in 1873, he had been living on it more than 3 years, because that was the law. He had to survey it off and live on it 3 years or more, and you could get a title. You could get the deed to it. And he did that. So then it was settled by families. It was the Hightowers, the two Johnson families, Sowers, Allens, Memphis Allens and them family, they was kin to the Sowers. The Carters and the Glazes were the basic families that was living in this community, I know, in the 1800s. You know, there were not many great changes that happened from, say, 1900 until after World War II. This community, well, most of Walker County was a farming area, and those people that own their own teams and land and farming equipment, they usually get up in the morning and take care of the animals. Usually everybody milked. So the first chore in the morning, about daylight, they'd be milking. And they milked more cattle than they could drink milk, because it was a source of protein for other animals like hogs and chickens and dogs and cats. You know, it was a source of food protein. Then following that, somebody would be getting the teams out of the pasture, and they would feed the horses in the morning and get them all ready. So, and then following that, the breakfast would be ready. They would go in and eat breakfast, and then right after breakfast, it's off to the field. And the jobs would already be laid out for everybody. You knew, everybody knew what they was going to do the next day. They'd seen that, they had done that the evening before. So then everybody would just take out from breakfast, going about their own job, whether it was chopping, whether it was plowing, whether it was picking, whatever the season demanded would be what activity would be going on. And then after the crops and all was gathered, then they start to getting together the wood for the winter. And they'd cut and split wood, and then if they had any fences that needed, like the lock fences would need new rails, the hog fences would need new rails, and they'd split those also. And that would be the kind of work that would be going on right after the crops was all harvested. My grandfather had the community syrup mill, where he would, you seen the harvest sides here, that was one of his sides. He had, but see, that just operated now from the time, that would operate probably from about early October through November. That's the time the cane would be up, you cut it, strip it, do what they do to clean it up, to run through the mill, get the juice, cook it out. Then following that, they'd get the wood. Following that, they'd kill hogs. Following that, they started breaking land for the next crop. So they had a year-round, it is a year-round process just to really make a living. Tip made coal from pine trees by burning it at a certain temperature, allowing a certain amount of oxygen to get to it, you know. So and how he did it, he made it in a kiln, and then he'd make it in the sand beds over there, where he could put sand on it. He'd start as far in the middle, and he could control the speed of burning by putting the sand over it, so to cut out some of the oxygen, and the coal wouldn't burn up. You know, if you put oxygen, you just start a fire there, your coal's gonna finally be ashes. Well, he could stop it before it was ashes by cutting off the oxygen. He gave anybody get some coal from Tip to iron, and they would iron, you know, put the coal in the ironing buckets and heat the smoothing irons and iron. But he sold it uptown to people that had money, and that's how he paid his taxes and everything on his land and their money. So that was a source of revenue for Tip. Well, most of them used a cotton crop as a little cash crop too. So even though they reared all of the food, they had a little cash crop, and that cash crop generally was cotton. And they had gins here, you know, you'd pick a bale of cotton and take it into the gin and have it gin and sell it and get whatever the revenue was, and it was in cash money. So that was the cash crop. See? Now Joe and them sold syrup, and my grandmother sold butter. Yeah, a little cash crop. Wasn't a whole lot, you know. Yeah. And it was open range all over here. That wasn't a stock bar. And so all of them had cattle, so they could sell a cow for $10 and get a little money. Lou was the syrup maker. He also always had all kinds of fruit. It's an apple tree still over there, across there, that he, you know, ordered or something, got from somewhere. And he had all kinds of Alberta peaches and grapes and tame berries, and, you know, he just liked that kind of stuff. Well, his dad was also a blacksmith, and he had a son, Jim, that kind of followed in that. And Jim lived right across the hill over there, and he always had the swings made that you see on porches, you used to see on porches, and the cowhide, rawhide bottom chairs. You ever seen that? Okay. He always had a supply of those for anybody that wanted to buy. If you needed some chairs, you could get them from Uncle Jim, and they'd be brand new, made out of the woods out here. They used red oak wood for the frame and put a cowhide across it for you to sit on. And those swings that you hang on the porch, everybody in this community pretty much had a Jim swing, you know, where they'd swing and put it on the porch, and then you come out and sit in the swing. Kids like to swing, you know. But it was community then. People lived in the community, and they shared their dues. But it was mostly community goodwill. Everybody had that job to do. If they needed some help, they could ask, and people would come and help. Just come and help them do whatever they needed to do. So nothing that was fixed, that I'm going to deliver your baby so you can help me do whatever this, but as it came up. And that's pretty well the way that was done. That was the way that was done. Nobody really looked for any finance out of assisting a community need at that time. They worked the roads together. You know, they'd be mad if somebody didn't have time to help too. You know, he didn't come and help. It was whatever was available in the community at that time was available to the people of that community, whether they had money or not.
My name is Sarah Hardy Bartee, and I was born on Christmas Eve in 1937 in my parents' home in New Waverly. I lived in that same house for 35 years. I married Avon J. Bartee on December of 1958, and he was my husband until he died in July of 1995. We had 3 children, Jeff, Jean, and Jennifer. I went to school for 11 years in New Waverly in the public schools here. When I started school, there was no bus service for those of us that lived within 2 miles of the school, and so we either had to walk or we went by private vehicle, and most of us got to walk or ride our bicycles. Of course, the school system at that time was segregated, so I went to the white school, and it was a beautiful old brick building with hardwood floors. The black children went to school over where the elementary campus is now. The grades 1 through 8, there was a frame building over there. It was not a good quality building, and it's very, I feel bad that when I look back and see how much better we had it than they did. We didn't think about it at the time, but I look back now and I know that they didn't have as good of facilities as we did. The black high school students were bused into Huntsville, and they went to the Sam Houston High School there for many years. I don't know how many school buses we had, but one of them was a bus that was a homemade bus. Mr. Vick, I think it was Mr. Willie Vick, in those years they would allow individuals to provide transportation. They would provide the bus and they would pay them, you know. And Mr. Vick had taken a truck of some sort and fashioned a wooden box type thing on the back and put little seats in it, you know, and it had windows on the sides and everything. But we kids can be so cruel, you know, and we call that the chicken coop, you know, and we would tease the kids who had to ride that bus and say, oh, y'all have to ride the chicken coop. Well, we were so ignorant, we were having to walk, you know, or catch a ride, but we liked to make fun of the ones that rode the chicken coop. When I grew up, the town was really laid back, you know. For one thing, there was no alcoholic beverages sold within the city limits here, and we didn't know what drugs were, you know. The drug was a drugstore where you went and got medicine, you know. I'd like to talk a little bit about the drugstore, quote, and it was a little bitty building. It was sort of like the Goolsby Drug of Huntsville. It's just a little narrow building, and as I got older, I found out that Mr. West, J. Homer West, ran the drugstore, and he wasn't even a pharmacy. Back in those days, doctors would leave some medicine there with him, and then they would call and tell him what to prescribe, you know, or what to give, and that probably was illegal, but since the doctors in here are all dead now, I guess it's okay for me to tell that, you know. And Dr. Cole used to come down on Saturday afternoon to see patients, and so you tried to wait, you know, till Saturday to get sick, and you would go in the drugstore and there were chairs lined up at the back, the little straight chairs, and people would sit there and wait patiently until Dr. Cole had time to see you. There was a post office here, of course, and it was a very small building. The post office has to do also with the railroad, which, although we just have a few freight trains that come through now, I can remember when we had at least 4 passenger trains that came through every day, 2 going north, 2 going south. They carried the mail, and that was the way we got it. They brought it in, and the mail was in a big, heavy sack that they would toss out in the daytime. And there was a a contraption of some sort. I don't know how to describe it except that it was a pole up high, probably 10 or 12 feet in the air, and the man would climb up there on this little ladder, hang the bag of mail there. The mail train would come by, stick this arm thing out, rake that in, and then he'd throw out the mail at the same time. He had to be coordinated, and every once in a while something would happen. The mail sack would get under the train and would run over it, and we kids thought that was funny. Letters would go everywhere, and I can remember laughing. The freight trains that came through, they stopped and picked up pulpwood. We no longer have any trains that stop to pick up anything, but pulpwood was a big industry then, and we had a sawmill here that took the long wood, but the pulpwood was shipped out to Houston, I think, to Pasadena, and there was always the freight trains coming in for that. The city itself had been laid out back in about 1872 when the railroad came through, and when the railroad was making its way from Houston to Chicago or wherever it went, it would go along and lay out little towns along the way: Willis, New Waverly, Riverside, because Huntsville chose not to be on the main line. And of course, the people who lived here, who came to New Waverly, came mostly from Old Waverly. It was just known as Waverly at that time. The railroad had planned to go through there, but the people out there did not want it. They said they did not want the riffraff that would be coming through on a train, and it'd be bringing in undesirables and everything. And so the railroad said, well, stay out there. And so they moved over about 9 miles and, ran it right by here, and people began to move to the railroad, and now Old Waverly is a real nice little community, but there's nothing there. The businesses moved away to be near the railroad. The stores that we had here, I was trying to think about how many we might have had. I was saying 10 or 12. That was probably in the neighborhood, and we had 2 or 3 cafes, and most of the stores were general merchandise, which they carried groceries, feed, hardware, a few clothes, shoes, and everything. And it was strange that certain families almost went to the same store each time. You didn't really shop around, the Smiths went here, the Hardys went here, the Joneses went here, and whatever. When I was in high school, I was fortunate enough to work in one of those stores. I worked for Roby Hardy in his general merchandise, and that was an experience. And that store, in the front, there was the vegetable and fruit bins right at the front as you came in. Then you got to the canned goods on one side of the store, and then there was the meat market, and they had this long display case back there. And most of the time, John Lee Slott would come in and help cut up the fresh meat that we got. It wasn't packaged and brought in from somewhere else. They would bring in a beef, and he would cut it up. And then there was an old black gentleman that worked there. His name was Claude Carter, but everybody knew him as Pap. And Pap worked the meat market. He also swept the floor every afternoon before we closed. He also loaded any feed that had to be loaded out back, and he sacked nails if they needed to be sacked, and he answered all kinds of questions. And all this time, as I got older, I wondered if Pap ever washed his hands between the times that he did all these other things. But we seemed to have survived. And we had an ice house here. And most of the time now when you hear of an ice house, that's where you go sit and have a cool one in the afternoon or something. But this was actually where they sold ice. And people would come by and they'd slide out this thing and chip them off a 25-pound block or 50-pound or 100-pound, whatever. And one of the things when I was real little, my grandparents lived in the country, and they didn't have electricity for many years. And then when they did get electricity, for a long time, they didn't have a refrigerator, but they had an ice box. And so they would get a block of ice and wrap it in a burlap bag. We called it a croaker sack, and wrap it up, and then put it either in the back of a truck, pickup truck, or on the bumper of the car and take off home, so that you get there before the ice melted. The stores here in town closed on Sunday. You better do all your shopping on Saturday, except that on Sunday morning for about 2 hours, there were 2 of the stores that would come down and open up. for about 2 hours, and then they would be gone. And the men who opened their stores closed them in time to go to their house of worship. It was they could make that dollar and then go on to church. We had a bus station here. The buses ran through here on a regular basis because Highway 75 was the main thoroughfare between Houston and Dallas, and people rode the bus a lot locally. We rode it if we needed to go into Huntsville to shop or go to the doctor. A lot of kids rode when they went to Sam Houston. They'd ride the bus. For recreation, one of the things that I can remember was the town had a softball team in the 40s, and they worked real hard and got them a nice softball field. But they got together and they built, got the field fixed, and I just thought it was amazing because we had bleachers that I thought they were real high. Thinking back, they probably weren't over 12 foot tall, but I thought it was almost like the Astrodome. And behind the backstop, they had the speakers announcer, and the scorekeeper could sit up there, and we kids, if we were real good, could go sit up there, and be quiet. And there was an oak tree over along about the first base line there, and under the oak tree was where the concession stand was, and that was 3 boards stuck up on some posts around a tub of ice that had some soda pop in it, and that was the concession stand. And my daddy ran the concession stand, so I usually had to help out over there. We also had tent shows that came around. These were people that it was similar to a traveling circus, except that all they did, they came in with their tents, set them up somewhere, and most of the time, as best I remember, they were right on the place where City Hall is located now. That was a vacant lot. And they would set up their tent and stay here about a week or 10 days, and every night you'd go down and pay your 10 cents or whatever it was, and they had these wooden bleachers that that were collapsible they took with them. They would set these up, and you'd go in and you could watch Tarzan movies or Bob Steele movies, they were all westerns or some sort of adventure type things, and a comedy. I don't remember there ever being, I don't think they were modern enough to have any newsreels like we used to see when we went to the movies, like in Huntsville at a theater. But they had, and we didn't care if we watched the same movie over and over, and it was really a big thrill to get to go there. And there was always some of the kids that tried to slip under the side of the tent and not have to pay, and they'd always, somebody would tell on them, or the people would catch them and drag them out. And one time, some of the kids had got mad because they had caught them slipping under the tent, and they reprimanded them and maybe called the law or something, and they got mad, so they tied a rope onto the tent or one of the poles, and when one of the freight trains stopped that night, they tied it onto the train, and when the train started driving off, it started pulling the tent down. Luckily, there was nobody in the tent. It was after hours and everything, and the engineer noticed it in time that he didn't drag it completely. In 1952, our city became incorporated, and one of the big things that happened was we got street lights. We didn't have any street lights when I grew up, and we didn't think anything about it. We wandered around after dark. We'd walk from house to house, and we girls didn't think anything about walking 5 or 6 blocks after dark. And then about the mid-50s, the community decided that we needed a fire department. We just really thought it was, we were really big time because we had one truck, and it had a big tank on the back that they carried water in because, we didn't have a water system here at that time. We just had water wells, and they'd go to ponds and suck the water out, because our water system did not go in until 1963, and our sewer system went in after that. So I grew up around everybody having their own outhouse in a path, or you had a septic system, and a lot of it, the field lines ran to the ditch, and I had a lot of green grass in front of your house.
The Civil War was over, and with it, the end of slavery. Reconstruction ushered in new advances in political equality. However, these reforms were short-lived, and new policies prevailed. Separate schools and churches, segregated public facilities, and eventually, voting booths for whites only. Finally, in a landmark decision handed down in 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously banned segregation in the public schools. And although it would take another 15 years to achieve compliance, the first step had been taken towards racial equality. The following excerpts are taken from conversations with a number of Huntsville area residents, past and present, in recounting their personal experiences with segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement. It becomes clear that separate was never equal.
Where City Hall is was all black owned. That was the heart of the black community. That's where all the black merchants were. There were funeral homes there. There were beauty parlors there. There were joints there. There was a center there, a community center there where the fraternal organizations would meet, where the Black Chamber of Commerce met, and it was just the center of things. The doctors, all the doctors had their offices around in there. They called it the run, the drag, and nigger run. But in my family, you could never get that word out of your mouth. But that was, blacks and whites referred to it as nigger run. But of course, that's where all the commerce is. But that was the heart of the black community.
You couldn't go in a drugstore and walk up to the counter because where they sold cold drinks and things. You had to stood off away from it. I remember going to the drugstore once to get something, and they yelled at me like I was a puppy. The boys up to college were quite devilish. Sometimes they'd meet you on the street and they'd get in abreast and woo you off the sidewalks or place like that, you know. And the white folks were, some of them were pretty good, and others didn't care a thing about you.
Now, I can recall the days when I was, my mother was, everybody born in Woods, you know, and my mother would send me to town. I'm about 8 or 9 years old. And as I say, mentioned the old sidewalks downtown with nothing but board to buy coal oil, kerosene. And the last thing she tells me, boy, let me tell you one thing now. I say, when you go down to get that oil, you see a white woman come down the street, you get to get off, see. Now I'm talking about I lived through a day down here when a black man or a black boy couldn't pass a white lady.
Well, I remember one time when Cliff and I were in San Antonio and we had to go to Huntsville, so we got on the bus in San Antonio and had to go to Houston. That bus was integrated, so there were blacks in the front and the back all over, and they were just all mixed up. But so when we got to Houston, we got off that bus and got on another bus from Houston to Huntsville. We got on a little bit late, and most of the seats were full, and we wanted to sit together. And so what we did, we went all the way to the very back and sat at the back part of the bus. After we were seated, black woman got on the bus. Well, I guess there were 2 seats left, but they were near the front. And that woman wouldn't sit down, and she just stood there, and finally the bus driver saw what the situation was, that she couldn't sit down in the front. And so he went back there and had Cliff and my brother Cliff Kenninger and me move up to the front, fill in those places so that she could sit in the back. And I thought that was really unusual. Mother, you had something to do with Pauline Campbell. What project were you on with her?
In 1950, she and I were elected from this area to go to the White House Conference on Children in Washington. And so we started out on the train, and then we got together, and then we got over into another state, and they told her she would have to move. So I just moved with her. And it was such a stir that embarrassed her. And she said, look, this just won't do. I appreciate it, but she said, you're getting me in trouble and you're getting in trouble. So that was a real uncomfortable experience.
And what I can remember is the poll tax. Having to pay the poll tax. It was only $1, but for a lot of people that was a lot of money. And I kept my poll taxes. I had 3 poll taxes, and I think one of the interesting things about those is that the first one or two, it shows on there, there's a place to put what your race is, black or white. And the last one no longer has the race part in it. But what would happen was that the people who had the voting list then could call up, say just the white people. If they thought the black people weren't going to vote for their candidate, they would just call up the white people to remind them to go out and vote. The other thing about the poll tax was that you could buy the poll taxes in January, and the last day to buy a poll tax was January the 31st, and the election wasn't until November. And if you hadn't remembered in January to buy that poll taxes, then you couldn't vote, no matter how excited you got about it. So one of the things that my father, Rupert Kinninger, did was he got a bunch of sociology students together, and they set up a card table out in front of Grant's grocery store, because blacks always went to Grant's grocery store. There were certain grocery stores that they went to, and so they set up this card table out in front of there, and anybody could become a person who sold poll taxes. That was real easy, okay. So they would set up there in January and sell poll taxes to the black people, and that just infuriated the local authorities.
Last year at the country campus, I believe Moselle taught at the Riverside, and I think Tyson second, third grade for a chance. I don't know. Anyhow, the bus, we were up on the close to the entrance, the gate, and the houses were close to the little street. I can see that bus pulling up there, and Tyson had a little yellow raincoat, and it wasn't 50 feet from the house to the bus, and he'd run across there and jump in on a rainy morning. I got that old 39 Ford warmed up, started up to campus in my own car, and about a mile up there, half a mile, I saw 3 children walking. A girl perhaps just in her teens, and 2 little boys smaller. They were black children. And I thought I ought to give them a ride because they're going a mile or 2 up here to this little 2 or 3 teacher rural school. And I pulled over and asked them would they like to ride, and the girl shook her and said, we can't do that. Of course they couldn't get in the car with me. And I drove about 10 miles to Huntsville thinking about things that are not right. And it was wrong. It had been wrong a long time. I watched the bus stop the other day. It was messy. It wasn't quite rainy, but it was cold. And on our street, when he stopped, there must have been a half a dozen little young ones of all colors came scooting out of there into their houses on both sides of the street. And I had just written a check on taxes, and I felt pretty good about some of my money going there.
Kelly Edgar McAdams was born in Walker County on September 23, 1903. His family settled in Texas before 1836, making their living from the land as ranchers and farmers. Mr. McAdams talks about the pioneer spirit of his family and reminisces about his first encounter with a train and a memorable trip to the picture show.
My family came out of South Carolina. It took them 3 years to get across from South Carolina to Texas. They were hunting free land. They finally, I guess, I had a great uncle that was born in Tennessee. They come out of South Carolina to Tennessee, and Tennessee down to Alabama, and Alabama right straight across. They were poor people. They didn't have anything, and they had to stop and make a crop or work for somebody or something like that. They finally got to Texas. When they got to Texas, Texas was Mexico at the time. It wasn't Texas. That was before Texas got independent. They got there and they said, "Oh, we can't get into that free land. And we got to all be Catholic." And so what did they do? They become Catholic. But in 7 years, Texas gained independence. Of course, when they got the independence, then they switched, and we've been Baptists ever since. But by that time, they had moved from up here in Sabine County, north and east of here. And the reason they moved is one of the brothers, there was a big family of them, always big families. One of the brothers got ambushed with up there in that no man's land, or the outlaw's land. There was a strip of Texas at the time that part of Texas didn't belong to Louisiana and part of Texas didn't belong to Texas. So the old man, my great-great-grandfather, he got ambushed. And when he got ambushed, the old man said, "Look, we're going to move." And he just moved the entire bunch to Walker County. And since that time, we've been in Walker County. My granddad, he had 2 wives. The first wife died when she was 32 years old. And that was my father's mother. And of course, the old man, he married again. They had 6 children, and the first one had 6 children, and so there's 12. And all these 12 children, my grandfather by that time had gotten over 5,000 acres of land. And we didn't own all of it, but we had control of that area. One time my grandfather, he said, "Kelly, I want to show you and Edgar that we have oil on this place." He said, "I got an old megaphone that off of a graphophone, turned it upside down." And he put it in, he dug a trench around it and put it on there. And he said, "Let's let it sit there a while." And it sat there a while. And he took a match and lighted it, and it was a little flame about that large. He said, "Do you know we got oil on this place? It's escaping oil on it, and we never have got any oil on that particular spot." One time my mother wanted to show the train to us. So we got down pretty close to where the train was coming in, and they used to have a train that runs from Navasota up to Madisonville, and they turned it around and went to get back. So we had a train twice a day. Everybody would like to go to the train if possible, you know, see people get on, people get off, and that's the only way we could get anywhere. Mama had Kelly by the hand, and GB by the hand. That engineer blew that train, and I was too close to it. GB jumped, but Mama could hold him. I ran, and Mama took maybe several hours to find Kelly. We didn't have any movies in Beedies, anywhere close to Beedies. But Navasota did have a movie. That was 30 miles away to the south. Papa put us all four in a car. We had a car by that time. We had a good cotton crop. They started out from Beedies to Navasota. We finally got there in time for the show. We saw this To Hell with the Kaiser, because everything was to hell with Kaiser, you know. And we started back home. We got back home about daylight. And what was the trouble? Our trouble was flats. Flats, flats, flats. We had more than fix a flat did if you go down. There was those sand hills and everything else. And a patch just wouldn't hold. It just wouldn't hold at all. Finally, we got home all right, but just by the skin of the teeth.
There's not much left of the town. 2 overgrown graveyards, an old water well long dry. But 150 years ago, Cincinnati, Texas was a bustling river port town on the west bank of the Trinity River. The hub of shipping in East Texas, Cincinnati was the terminal through which the area's agricultural produce passed on its way to Galveston, the eastern seaboard, or to Europe. George Hunter was a leading citizen and proprietor of Hunter's Tavern, a stopover for stagecoach and steamboat travelers alike. What follows is an account of the Hunter family and the final days of Cincinnati as told by descendant Joseph M. Smith.
This George Hunter, who ran the Stagecoach Inn, died in 1853 in March and is buried up there. His habit was to go to Galveston 2 or 3 times a year with some of the riverboat people and buy commodities and bring back to sell through his businesses there in Cincinnati. In the spring of 1853, he went to Galveston on a boat called the Fanner. They got to Galveston and they would stay for several days. While they were there, the captain came to George and said, "George, I got a delivery to make up to Houston, go up the ship channel to Houston." And says, "Come and go with me. Some more passengers are going to go too, and I'm going to take the commodities up there and we'll unload and then we'll come back to Galveston." So George went with him. Well, coming back into the harbor at Galveston, as he described it, the Fanner got in a race with another old riverboat, and they got the darn boiler so hot the thing blew up. And it killed the captain outright. It scalded George Hunter, and they put him in the hospital. While he was there, another riverboat captain came to visit him, and George told this other captain, he says, "I'm afraid I'm not going to make it, and if I die, would you please see that I get buried at Cincinnati? I want to be buried at home." And that all happened. He lived 3 days, I think, after the explosion and passed away. Well, they started back upriver on this other boat, and in those days there was no such thing as embalming. They didn't know what it was, just like they didn't know what yellow fever was or what caused it. Well, there were other passengers on the boat, and the owner got serious with those other passengers, and they begged the captain to pull over to the bank and let's bury this man. We can't stand it. And the captain told them if one body on that boat got to Cincinnati, it was going to be George Hunter, because he promised him he'd take him home to bury him. Well, they had a whiskey salesman on the boat, and they got a keg of whiskey from him and tightened the box airtight and poured in this keg of whiskey, and that saved the day for him. So that's the way George Hunter's buried up there. And the yellow fever hit the same year, which was in the late summer, early fall. T.J. Hunter, he was 17 years old, and they had sent him here to Huntsville to what he called the academy to go to school. And he said on a Wednesday, I believe it was, that he got word that his mother was ill. And he said on Friday, I got word that my mother was gravely ill and I needed to come home. And he said he went to the hotel, which was somewhere in the neighborhood of where the Methodist Church is today. But that's where the stage from Houston would stop, and then they went on north through Cincinnati. But he said he went there late that afternoon to the hotel to catch the next stage, which came through at 4 o'clock on Saturday morning. And he said they got to Cincinnati at 7 o'clock, and his mother lived about 15 minutes and passed away. But what had happened, really how the yellow fever got started there, the week before, a man who lived in Palestine had been to Galveston visiting relatives and friends for 1 or 2 weeks, and then he caught the stage back from there to Houston, to Huntsville, to Cincinnati. And when he got to Cincinnati, he was very sick, and he asked Arabella if he could stay the night. So she kept him. She was noted for taking care of people up there, evidently, nursing a whole lot, and ran the stagecoach in. She was still running that. And so she took him in and nursed him that night, and the next morning he was worse, and he told her that he was afraid he was going to die and he wanted to go home to die. Would she please put him on the next stage? Which she did, and I don't know whether he made it home or what. We never knew his name. But this all comes from T.J. Hunter's memoirs. He wrote about all that. Of course, he experienced all of it. But that's how yellow fever actually got started. And his mother was the first inhabitant of Cincinnati to die there, the first inhabitant. He said about a week later there were several women and some children got sick, and some of them died. A lot of people used to blame the demise of Cincinnati on yellow fever, but the coming of the railroads is what killed Cincinnati, because there was no more boat travel on the river after that. They could get things in and out of this country by rail.
The first prison system started here in 1848 with a grand budget of $5,000. They bought the land, and the whole bit sustained it for a year or 2 years until the next budget was set up with that $5,000. They didn't start out with about 13 inmates, so they didn't have to have a large facility. And as it grew, of course, the makeup of the system and the prison facilities changed. the pictures that I have seen of the old one, they were just buildings, and they were walled together, not enclosed in the wall the way we see it now. And they were just walled from building to building. And then there was one side of it that was walled so that there would be some outside exercise area, whatever they wanted to use it for. The walls at the wall unit is very deceiving. It is 32 feet tall. And on the inside, over the years, the dirt, what dirt is in there, has washed down against the back wall. And they have just left it there. And it is, the height on the inside is not the height on the outside. And when you get to the top of the wall and start over on the other side, you have a very rude awakening.
They said this convict went over the wall on a foggy, dark night, and said when he had to jump off, had no ladder on the outside. They found the convict on the outside of the wall, propped up against a tree with two broke legs. He didn't go very far when he jumped over that 20-foot wall on the backside. A prison escape. The local people wouldn't know it until we read about it in the Houston paper the next day. And the only way you could tell was they'd take the bloodhounds and turn them loose. And bloodhounds run under your house. Well, you figured there was convict out. So that information was kept strictly confidential from the local people. And one of my neighbors over on 13th Street, about 4 blocks from the prison, got his car stolen. They was working on the new rodeo arena in the 40s. When they went from the wooden stadium, as the picture shows, to the brick as we see it now, and they formed up this convict. They were forming for some columns. Well, they put this convict in this form and tacked him in lightly. And when the crew left after dark, he kicked the form loose and slipped out and stole our neighbor's car out of a garage. And my daddy's car was sitting right in front of the house with a key in it now.
But we have them from everything from bent forks that's been sharpened to razor blades that's been melted into the end of a toothbrush that they use. We have clubs that they have made and they've used on one another. A real good one is the old, what they call the lock in the sock. You use a padlock that they could have in, put it in a sock and then tie it and use it like a billy club.
That's a paintball.
They have a paintball that they have stripped the paint off the wall, and through heat from their own hands or heat from the hot water have squished it together.
And it's very heavy, very heavy. And they put that in a sock and made a pretty formidable weapon.
The last one that they brought in to me that the school kids are enjoying is an empty shampoo bottle. The lid is off of and the bottom has been taken out of. And put through that empty shampoo bottle is an arrow that is made out of rolled up newspaper and dampened so it will harden and stick together. And then on the end of it is a flattened piece of tin that they've gotten out of the shop somewhere and made it just like the head of an arrow, and it's sharpened on the edges and on the point. And then their sling that goes with it is the rubber is made out of the rubber out of the inmate's shorts, and he has it tied together with a little piece of material, and you can use it like a bow and arrow. They brought me one recently. It's a fountain pen, and they've taken the inside out of the fountain pen, and in the cap of it they have replaced it with
60-penny nail.
60-penny nail that they have sharpened on the end, and then you slide it back in and it looks like just he's got a fountain pen in his pocket. So they're very ingenious. They can take practically nothing and make something out of it.
In 1931, the prison rodeo was started, and Mr. Albert Moore was credited as the father of the prison rodeo. It was exceptionally rough, and they called it the wildest rodeo behind walls, and I'm sure it was. Little or no outside involvement. As it become later year with movie stars and showmanship, they credit for its demise. But if there wasn't 4 or 5 people carried off on stretchers every Sunday, it wasn't a good rodeo. And the majority of the convicts that participated were strictly amateurs. The week before the rodeo started, they would usually have a practice that the townspeople could go up and watch for free, and they would get a little chance to practice rodeo, roping or riding or whatever. And of course, big as Texas is, there were a few convicts that come from West Texas, North Texas, and was professional cowhands or rodeo riders. And they always took the top honors. But the fun was that all the amateurs that decided they was going to be a cowboy for 4 weekends in October, and found out real quick that they weren't professional cowboys. It was fun, and it was their way of getting exposure. In 1937, the population was 4,999, and that'd be like 30,000 new people in Huntsville every Sunday in October. And the convicts, their names went on the loudspeaker in front of all those people, and it was a chance to be seen, and it was really exciting. Had calf roping, goat roping, and bull riding, bareback bronc, saddle bronc, and the climax, the action was a chariot race. It'd take 2 enormous bulls of 2,000 pounds or better, and they had these Roman-type chariots. It was on a swivel right in the middle of this bull's back, and he could run away from it or toward the chariot in which way he pleased. And that was the climax of the rodeo, was a chariot race. And sometimes the bull would get up in the other chariot, and it was very exciting.
I'm Kate Pritchett. I was born in 1904 in Huntsville, Texas, and I lived in Huntsville until 1923. My father and mother came to Huntsville in 1888. My mother's name was Nora Melissa Evans. My father's name was Joseph Lucian Pritchett. He came to teach math in the college, and that's what he did for 45 years. My father was head of the Bridge and Street Committee for the town. In fact, most of the sidewalks that were built in Huntsville, my father was responsible for. He was a great man to build streets and roads, and opened up so many roads around there. He was a very sweet man. He was small, and the students loved him, but he was very, very religious, and if he hadn't been so sweet, he could have been very domineering, because he kept the morals of the college. He always was the one that saw that they didn't dance and they didn't smoke and they didn't do anything improper. They weren't supposed to ride in cars. He was very, very strict morally. That was another thing my father did. He sort of inspected the boarding houses that the students lived in. There was one man that kept boarders, and the students felt as though the food was terrible, and they decided they would strike and they wouldn't eat it. So they came down to breakfast one morning, they all sat there and they refused to eat. And the man that ran the boarding house went into his room and came back with a rifle, and he said, "Now eat." And they ate. One way to get them to eat. But anyhow, my father and mother built this house in 1892. And at first, it was a very small house, and it kept being added on to as the family grew. And this is a picture of how it grew. This is the original house right here. My father started a private school in Huntsville because there was no public school at that time. It was a one-room schoolhouse, and he brought this German woman down to teach his children, and she lived with us. But the children in town, practically all the children in town that we knew, came to that school, this one-house school. But the private school was interesting. My father had it moved over and attached to our house after the public school started. So that was the kitchen, the schoolhouse. But my father was taught astronomy, and so he had this building built so he could put his telescope in there. This had a flat roof, and it would come off so they could look at the stars. It was attached by latches. It was a very interesting thing. The Episcopal Church that I can't tell you exactly where it was, but it was close to town, wanted to build a new Episcopalian church. So they sold the old one to my father, and he had it moved from at least a half a mile down from the center of town to our backyard, and that became our barn. The Episcopal minister's study became our servants' house where the cook lived when I was growing up. My father, as I say, always had horses. He built these stalls under the church, and that's where the cows and the horses ate, and that's where he milked the cows. This is a picture of one of his horses at a watering trough there in the barnyard. We children loved this old house because it was filled with hay. When my sister, who was older than I, was growing up, she wanted to have a barn dance. And she had house guests at the time, and my father said she could have the barn dance, but she'd have to invite all the young people in town. We never could discriminate on who we had. Well, there was one man in town my sister didn't want to invite. That was Gwen Murray. And my father said, if you have the barn dance, Gwen Murray's got to come. So Gwen Murray came. There's an old custom in barn dances and corn shuckings that the man that gets the red ear of corn can always kiss the hostess. And of course, Gwen Murray got the red ear of corn, my sister. That was very glamorous to me. I was a child. Now, you see, it was quite a long way from our house out to the barn. And they had strung Japanese lanterns all the way back out there to the barn for this barn dance. And there was the church had a choir loft as you walked in here. And they had some kind of an orchestra, I don't know, probably two musicians. It sounded like a lot of music to me as a child. They played for the barn dance up there. We had an old black man by the name of Wyatt that kept his tools back there to work, the lawnmower. And he and I went into business one time because he had a mole trap. We had a lot of moles in the yard, and he would trap them and skin them and put them up on a board to dry, and then he sold them to Mr. Josie, who gave him $1 a piece for those moleskins. I don't know, I guess they must have sold it to some company to make moleskin coats, I don't know. But Wyatt took me in his business. Well, I never got any money out of it, because I was supposed to be in that business. Wyatt was a wonderful man. He worked for the family about 20 years, I guess. And when I was a child, apparently I was a crybaby, and he said he used to, at breakfast time, they would give me to him to take care of while they ate breakfast. And he wasn't very happy. But I loved it because we had a lot of property out here before we got to the house. So they used a 2-horse lawnmower to mow this field. And Wyatt used to put me up on the driver's seat, and he walked behind, so I sort of liked it. Wyatt was a wonderful old man. He was very religious, but he also like his toddy, and they were going to have a election in Huntsville for local option. And my father was trying to argue with Wyatt, saying, you know, Wyatt, I want you to vote the dry ticket. He said, you have to admit, Wyatt, that liquor is your worst enemy. And Wyatt looked at my father and he says, I knows that, Professor Joe, but you know the good old books say love your enemy. This was our outdoor privy. When I was a child, I think we put in an indoor toilet when I was about 4 years old. This was a tennis court that my father built. This was my mother's chicken house. My mother was very proud of her Plymouth Rock chickens. In this coop, she had about 15 frying-sized chickens. There was a big tree that ran by the side of it. It had been hit by lightning, and they had put it together with iron bars, and it attracted lightning. And the lightning struck that tree 2 or 3 times. But one time it struck the tree, and it went right down the trunk of the tree into the chicken pot. There were 15 chickens ready to eat, but my mother had them all buried because the lightning had killed them. And the next day, all day long, we had people coming to the door. Miss Pritchett, we heard you had some chickens that were hit by lightning last night. And my mother said, yes, but I had them buried this morning. Miss Pritchett, you shouldn't have had them chickens buried. Them chickens was good. The Lord done killed them chickens.
My name is Andrew Martinez. I was born in Galveston, November the 30th, 1930. My folks had already moved to Huntsville at that time, but due to the Depression, the mill was not able to start up. And so my family moved back to Huntsville about 1931. Our family came from the Monterrey, Mexico, in that vicinity. My uncle, Donicio Martinez, was the first one of the family that moved. Then my father, Jose Martinez. After the mill got opened up, which would be about 31, 32, my uncle was working with the crews that were building the lumber runs that the Model Ts would travel on. They tried to do that on the dirt, but there was so much sand here that they couldn't motivate, so they decided to build lumber runs. It was lumber street is what it amounted to. Some of them, you know, would be up 12 feet high off the ground, but it took a lot of hard work to get those built up. My father was a mechanic that designed the Model Ts. They cut them to where they could accommodate pulling the lumber dollies behind them. My grandfather, on my mother's side, was a contractor of laborers for Mr. Batcher. They were also very instrumental in helping build the sawmill, getting it put together and everything. Our living quarters was between the white settlement and the black settlement. So I guess, I don't know if we were a buffer or what, but the white community was there along Avenue B down to around the commissary, and they would extend all the way down to where the shop was. Then you had the Mexican community, and then there were about, I don't know, 10 or 15 houses. I don't remember exactly, but then the black community was further back out towards the woods. Our houses were single wall. They had one single wall on the outside, and no insulation. They didn't have the interior wall. Now the white houses did have them. And you say, how do you know? Well, I was an Iceman, and I could see the difference. You know, to me, it didn't make any difference because we were able to survive the hard winters and the hot summers. Grandma Batcher was, she was kind of our angel. You know, Huntsville was made up mostly of Anglo and black people. And so when all these Mexicans came in, man, it was tough. They just couldn't handle it. We were raised Baptists, and the Baptist church didn't see fit to teach us Sunday school. So Miss Batcher, Grandma Batcher, being a Methodist, so she said, well, I'll take them over there. So we went to the Methodist church, and I remember we couldn't buy groceries. We couldn't buy clothes. It wouldn't sell to us. People say, well, Mr. Batcher put the commissary because he wanted to get all the money from the workers, and that's not true. Miss Batcher put the commissary in because the people had to have somewhere to buy food. And so we were able to buy whatever we needed in a commissary, you know, clothes, school clothes. About the late 30s, the people in town started complaining because they were not getting any of the economical impact that was created here, you know, and they finally woke up to the fact that, hey, these people really spend money, you know. And of course, you have to realize that most of the workers only made about $1, $1.50 a day. We went to school with these other kids, and that was another experience, you know, because again, we were very few in number, and here we are with a majority of Anglos, and I tell people, I say, man, we fought the Battle of the Alamo every recess, every day of the school year. I just barely remember it now, and some uncles and aunts of mine had gone to Westfield, and coming back from Conroe, they had put Mexican flags, and they had streamers running off of them and stuff, you know, and of course they drove back from Conroe and they came through Huntsville, and man, they got stopped real quick. What is all of this stuff? And what? Some Mexicans said, this ain't Mexico, get that stuff off of there. And so that kind of killed our Mexican pride. When we were going to school, we were told you don't speak Spanish in the classroom or in the playground area. And so by the time that I was 19, 20 years old, I couldn't speak very few words in Spanish. Those first 12 years, it was a hard time, but it was a happy time. You know, my uncle would come in one day. He said, "Well, got another blowing in. Let's kill the hog." So, and the men would get in and help kill the hog, butcher it, and then the women would prepare the meat. Monday is wash day. That meant you had to build a fire, boil the water. You have to have rinsing water. For a long time, we had to haul water, but by the time I was 6, 7 years old, we ran a water line. We had one spigot, and everybody would come in the community would come and get their water from the Mexican community. Saturday was going to the picture show, you know, in the evenings and stuff like that. And of course, everybody went to the movies on Saturdays. We'd have hamburgers on Saturday night, and then we'd go to the picture show. We had church every Sunday, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. Our Sunday school was in the summertime was a big persimmon tree, you know, across the street from where our church was at. My teacher was my aunt, which is Angelina, and my uncle was a preacher, Donicio. And in the afternoons, we'd play baseball or football, whatever was going, you know, in that particular season, is what we played. Summertime, you know, in summertime it was real hot. It would be 10, 11 o'clock before you could sleep. So we'd play out on, you know, and when they finally put in one lonely street light out, well, we had a place to, we can play football late at night. And I remember when we bought our first radio. And we were the first ones to have one in our community, you know. And so when Joe Louis had his fight and all this, man, all the people would gather at our house to hear the fight, you know. So this would also bring some of the white people come over and listen to the fight with us, and then the black people would come up and listen to the fight. So because we all worked together, we lived separate, but we all worked together, and we had a kind of a common bond there.
Pioneers, lured by the promise of grants of land from the Mexican government, began to settle portions of eastern Walker County as early as 1825. In time, a community formed, and with the coming of the railroad, the town of Dodge began to prosper. Jane Rorick Bartee, a descendant of early resident John Rorick, talks about the town's history from its heyday at the turn of the century to its decline during the post-war years. Her aunt, Carrie Rorick, continues the story with recollections of her own life in Dodge.
Probably Dodge was in its heyday, I would imagine, the turn of the century. Dodge had a bank, it had several stores, an ice house, a meat market. Dodge had a hotel, and the Missouri Pacific Railroad line stopped there and unloaded all the cargo and everything, and people from surrounding towns would come to Dodge and get their goods that they had ordered. And it was a very thriving town at that time. After the war, World War I, when the men came home, there was nothing much left there for them to do, and they began to go into Houston and other places like that to find jobs and something, you know, for them to support their family on. But then in the probably mid to late 40s, the pulpwood industry came in pretty big in Dodge, and so that kept some of the people in Dodge, but then there was not enough money in that, so they all began to leave. The pulpwood contractors, my dad was a pulpwood contractor, and he would go out and purchase X amount of trees and stuff off of a landowner's place, and then he would go in and cut it and load it and then unload it onto the cars of the train, and then he would get his money from the railroad company.
I'll be 79 years old, and I moved to Walker County at the age of 2. And we moved from Weldon, Texas, that's up in Trinity, you know, above Trinity. We moved down here in a wagon, a covered wagon. We moved 3 miles from where I live now, down a farm. We had no electricity, no running water. We farmed and grew a lot of cotton, corn, peas, whatever, you know. But everywhere you went, you walked or rode in a wagon. My dad, back in early 30s, walked from where I live to the fish hatchery, worked 8 hours and walked back for $1 a day. 1 penny went for Social Security. Went on to school, and I finished school in 36. In 37, I got married. I worked at home, grew all the vegetables and chickens and milk cows, sold milk for 15 cents a quart. I walked from where I live up here to the store and bring 6 quarts in one hand, 6 in the other in a little basket. And they sold the butter for 25 cents a pound. And I used to ride the horse. We had a few cows, and they was open range. And right after they built 190 down there, they all would go down on 190, and my husband would be going off cutting pulpwood. I had a little horse. It was a great saddle horse. I'd get on that horse and I'd ride, and I had a dog, put my gun on the saddle, go down way down in that St. Jacinta bottom and look and find all the cows. So one day I rode up on a black man down there. He was squirrel hunting. I found my cow in a car. That's when the highway was first built, and they got up on the highway and this car hit this cow, and she was dragging her leg. She had a little tiny calf. And this old black man, I had known him for a long time. I said, I won't ever get that cow home. He said, Miss Carrie, said, I tell you what, said, you get up on the horse, and I will hip that calf up on the saddle with you. And said, the cow will follow you home. And the horse could have thrown me and the calf and everything, but anyway, I started back home, and all the cows was following me. But my dog would keep them in a bunch. Passed a little sawmill down there, and Mr. Benj that lived out here, he said he never did ride a horse, and so he saw me riding that horse with that calf up on it. So that night he came down to my house. He wanted to buy that horse. My husband said, I don't want to sell that horse. He said, I never rode a horse in my life, but if she can ride that horse with a calf up in front of her, said, I can ride him. Okay. Finally taught my husband the notion and sent him the horse. He sold him the horse, and he rode him up here in Dodge. And my nephew was up there, and he said, Mr. Benz, let me show you how I'm a cowboy. So he got up on him, and he spurred him like that, and he pitched him just way up in the air, you know. I was afraid that Mr. Benji wouldn't want the horse afterwards, but he kept the horse.
Widowed in 1947, Grace Longino found herself alone with the responsibilities of 2 children. After 22 years as wife and helpmate of William Longino, professor at Sam Houston Normal Institute, Mrs. Longino prepared to face a series of personal and professional challenges which would impact upon her life, as well as that of her community.
My husband's death was a very tragic thing. He had gone to Mexico with a Mexican field school. And then the college wanted him to go because, of course, he knew the language, he knew the people. But he wasn't young anymore, and I didn't want him to go. And I told him all the different reasons I didn't want him to go. And I was apprehensive about it, and he would go and tell Dr. Lohman what I said. And Dr. Lohman said, oh, well, we know that. They did all the things that I told him, warned him against. They sent him on the bus with the kids, and he had all the responsibility. Well, the net result was his heart wouldn't stand it, and he got to Puebla with the kids, and he got to the hotel, and he says, I'm Professor Longino from Sam Houston State Teachers College, and I brought my students, and dropped dead right there at the counter. So Dr. Lohman, of course, came over to talk to me, and he says, now, we're going to take care of you. Don't you worry. We're going to take care of you. And says, I've got something in mind. So when the time came, what he wanted me to do was entirely different from what I wanted. He had, the Board of Regents had been real unhappy with Dr. Lohman. He hadn't given any thought to the grounds and the physical appearance of the campus. And so the Board of Regents took him to task for that. They said, Harmon, your college, your campus is the worst in the system. Now get busy and do something about it. Well, he'd just been rebuked for that. And I had established quite a reputation in Huntsville as a horticulturist. I've been president of the garden club 3 different times, and people would be calling me to say, when do I put out pansies, and where do I order daffodils, and all that sort of different things, you know. So I fitted his plans exactly. Here was somebody that needed a job, and she'd work for very little. I said, no, I want a student assistant job. And I very forcefully reminded of how persuasive Dr. Lohman could be. But in spite of my good judgment, he said, I tell you what, we're going to build you a greenhouse, the likes of which you've never seen. Went on to tell me all about this greenhouse he's going to build for me. And of course, being a horticulturist, that's just wonderful, the idea of having something like that. And I couldn't help but be enticed. And he says, I want you to have 5 acres of land for a nursery so you can have something to work with. He says, give you any help you want. So he kept on it until finally, in spite of my good judgment, I was seriously considering it. But I still knew that it wasn't a sensible thing to do. I still wanted something that I could handle and get through with. But anyway, I bravely started. And of course, when I went to talk to the business manager about all this funding, he said there's not a cent set up for that. So I said, how am I going to manage? And he said, well, we'll see, we'll see. When I started to find that 5 acres of land, do you know I couldn't find 5 acres of land that anybody wanted to part with? Finally, I found a little corner that was big enough for me. And you know, these carpenters have these shacks. So I had them pull that little creation down at this little neck of the woods there, the campus that I could use for a nursery. And I had me a little greenhouse, and I had me a little nursery. So I got busy, beautify the campus. Now I was campus beautician, I'll have you know. That's what they told me I was all the time, but I went on the payroll as grounds superintendent. And at the end of the year, Dr. Lohman's campus was voted the best one in the system. And everybody was so impressed. And every now and then, somebody would come up to me and say, I tell you, it's just wonderful what you're doing. And I do wish you had the park. They called me in and proposed that I take the responsibility of the museum and grounds. I looked at them and I said, well, how much, I've been through this now. How much money will I have? Well, we can't give you any money. We can't give you a dime. I said, oh? And I said, how much help will I have? Well, we can't give you any help either. Says, we're just cut to the bone here. We got to watch everything. And I said, well, I can't take a job I can't do. He said, oh, well, don't worry about that. Just go down and put in your hours and quit. That's the actual words. And that was their attitude, too. Well, I couldn't do anything like that. And I knew I couldn't. And Dr. Lohman, though, went into great lengths about what a terrible injustice it was for them to have all of this great responsibility and no funding for it. He says, none of the other colleges have a handicap like that. He says, we want you to go over to the legislature and get an appropriation and take care of that place. He says, I want them to draw a line and says this much is for the college and then this much is for the Sam Houston Museum. And I want you to see to it. And then when I went back again to talk to the business manager, he said the same thing. And he went even further and said, if you don't get the appropriation, we're just going to close the whole place down. They weren't going to fiddle with anything any more expense about the place. And well, I could see they meant every word of it. But I couldn't see doing it. And they were going to, they would not give me any choice. And I said, I just can't do it. I can't do it. And I'm not going to try. And then I got the keys and went over and opened up the museum. But terrible place. Just perfectly terrible place. Then when I went down to open the home, I was just appalled. As a housekeeper, you just can't stand a thing like that. The room smelled. You know how rooms smell if they're old and they're left shut up? And apparently she'd never bothered to open them, just even to air them, much less show people through. And there were dirt dauber nests all around. And there were curtains at the windows were in rags. And it was such a dismal place. And then the grounds were perfectly terrible. There were newspapers blowing into the bushes and debris. That place is neglected. And the whole place was that way. Of course, there had been no intelligent care of the place since 36. And this was 53. And there's 15 acres. Anyway, I took a broom and a dust cloth and I started in at the museum to see what I could do to make it decent. Couldn't do much. It was so neglected. So finally I thought, well, if I don't have money to work with, what do I have that I can use? And I realized that I had friends. And I said, well, I've got to work with what I can get, what I have. So I picked out 18 people from the faculty that I knew I could depend on and knew would help. And I asked Dr. Lohman to appoint them as an emergency committee and got them all together. And explained to them that I'd been asked to take this responsibility, which didn't surprise them at all, and that there was no money for it, which didn't surprise me either, and that the place was a disgrace, which they knew already. And I said, now, and I thought perhaps that all of you might help. And I've made out a worksheet here and divided this into jobs that just must be done before we can show it with any credit at all. And every one of them took a job and every one of them did it. The place looked a lot better. And so I cheered up some. So come 1st September, I was the new director of the Sam Houston Museum. Oh well, the turning point of the whole thing, as far as I was concerned, came in October of that first year. By that time, I'd gotten pretty smart. I thought I had gotten everything looking good enough, and I was for sure knew about Sam Houston, and I could answer all kinds of questions about Sam Houston, and I could tell a good story. And so I was beginning to feel pretty comfortable about the whole thing. And this particular time I had a man from Boston, and he wanted to see the home. And I showed him down with enthusiasm. And I thought I was doing well. But his mouth just got tighter and tighter. And then he said, well, you can't get any higher in Texas than Sam Houston. And turned then to me with absolute scorn and said, you Texans care nothing about your heritage. And so that was, I turned and walked off. But all of a sudden I was aware that I was a Texan and that I was responsible for this place, and that here we were disgracing the whole state. Got my pride all up in one hand and went to the prison the next morning. I said, I have to have help. There's no money, and the place is a disgrace. and I thought perhaps you might be send me some men. And he said, I'll do it. I'll send them in the morning. You just can't imagine how much a determined woman can get and with 6 able-bodied men. And not only that, but he left them 6 weeks. But finally he called them in, and he said, Miss Longino, I hate to do it. They're doing such a wonderful job, but if you can get together enough money to pay a guard, I'll let you have 3 permanently. I had been getting donations all along, of course, and turning them in. When I asked Mr. Holloman if I could hire a guard, he let me do it. So I had help. Time I had to get the appropriation to take care of the place. They had told me I had to get it, or they was going to close the place up. And I knew, and by that time I was absolutely determined that I was going to make the place something that every Texan could be proud of. And to this day, I'm just absolutely astonished that I'm just a plain ordinary housewife with no political connections whatsoever could start giving them appropriations to something they wasn't already funding. They had no right to expect me to be able to do it. But I did do it. Didn't ask for much, $15,000. I tell you, I was well off. Pretty soon, I had to get the appropriation to finish the museum. That was one of the big things. That's a little crowded little thing. I said, museum, I said, this is no honor to even a president of a PTA, much less Sam Houston. And I said, we got to get those wings on. Couldn't get the consent of the college to ask for it. They wouldn't put it on the legislative request. And so I thought, now what am I going to do about this? For that time, as I said, I knew Dr. Loman real well. And so I went over and talked to Dr. Loman about the budget request. I said, you know, Dr. Loman, I don't know whether you remember or not, but Price Daniels is a very historically minded governor. You know, he married Sam Houston's great-granddaughter. He named one of his sons Houston. And I think it'd be mighty good politics for this college to be very mindful of the Sam Houston Museum and very mindful of the Houston reputation and very mindful of Sam Houston's place in history. And that this budget request that I'm asking for the museum might just suit Price Daniels just fine. Might be something that he'd like to see go through. The next thing I knew, the college was willing to ask for it. Then the problem was to get it. And I remember Don Reed, very matter of fact, says, you're not going to get that appropriation. I said, no way you can get it. That's a very frugal-minded legislature. Well, I said, I am going to get it. I got to have it. He says, well, luck to you, but you're not going to get it out of this legislature. And I said, but I am going to get it. I've got to have it. I can't do anything with this place without it. Well, to the amazement of everybody, I did get it.